Okay. Today I'll uh, talk on convolutional neural networks. Why specifically I've chosen this particular topic is when Dr. Ravish contacted me to give a talk on neuroinstrumentation. Uh, I was little uh, uh, worried because my domain, though I started my career in the biomedical domain, me and Dr. Ravish were classmates while we were studying MTech at SJC Mysore in biomedical instrumentation. But long back, I've switched to the audio and speech as my domain, and I'm not actively working in the biomedical, to say frankly. But nevertheless, having said that, uh, this convolutional neural network is a perfect example of how two different disciplines, that is medical domain and engineering, of course many other disciplines have put their thoughts onto designing this one. Having said that, like, this is a perfect example of how medical domain can just get married with the engineering domain and come out with these brilliant solutions, like neural networks that we have. So, uh, uh, though of course the theme of this talk would be on the convolutional neural networks, the focus would be also on how the different disciplines can get motivated from other domains. Say, for example, here in this case, the neural networks uh, got motivated from the real brain and its working. So I'll just take you through that, and in a way, it should inspire how this medical domain, or let's say biomedical domain, should inspire other disciplines of engineering. So that's what I'll take you through. So these are some of the books that I've referred for this particular uh, topic or session, and not necessarily be very specific on the books, but these are some of the essential books that one has to go through in order to get into the domain of these neural networks as a broad topic. So now, of late, what do we call it as deep learning? It's a kind of enhancement over neural networks that were existing, say, a couple of decades back, basically. So one of the basic good books to refer is Artificial Neural Networks by B. Yagnanarayana is one good book to refer, and equally a well-written fundamental book is on Fundamentals of Neural Network Architecture, Algorithms, and Applications by Lauren Fawcett is another good book to look at, and very nicely and comprehensively written book called as Neural Networks: A Comprehensive Foundation by Simon Hyken is also a very good book to refer. So these three books lays down the actual foundations that are required for us to get into the domain of neural networks, or per se deep learning domain, what we in modern day we do refer it as. So then pattern classification, it's a very good book. Like, it links us with how the real world patterns do get mapped onto the ML and DL problems. So you also better read this particular book called as Pattern Classification by Richard O. Duda and Peter E. Hart and David G. Stork. Yeah. So then, off late, like, what is the kind of progress that neural networks domain has reached, and how it gets linked to the deep learning, and what all different types of deep learning algorithms we have, and what are the issues that are there in the deep learning, is all we can find in this particular book called as Neural Networks and Deep Learning by Charu C. Agarwal. Is also a very good book to look at. And what's best, like, if we can just directly study from people who have introduced the concepts of neural networks and deep learning algorithms to the scientific community. So here is one such good book to refer, that is Deep Learning by Ian Goodfellow, Yoshua Bengio, and Aaron Corbin. So these are some of the wonderful books like you people can always refer to if you people are interested in this particular topic. Then apart from that, like there are excellent YouTube material that I've used for this particular talk. Like say, for example, what is a neuron is, how does it work, and what are the different constituents of that neuron, why actually neuron works the way it works basically. So all that information can be obtained from this particular YouTube link that's called as Action Potential as part of that Harvard Extension School. Then we do have visual activity in the brain, say perhaps starting from the sensor, that is eye, and the parts involved in the eye, the retina, the fovea, and how it gets connected to the brain. Um, uh, then back, like how it gets connected to the visual cortex of the brain, and how does the information gets processed, right? So all that information can be found in these two YouTube links provided here. Then apart from that, like there was a famous experiment that was carried by two renowned scientists called as Hubel and Wiesel. They actually won the Nobel Prize for this particular work. They did carry this work on a cat, so they made the cat stationary by tying its neck and body and so forth and so on, and inserting an electrode to the neuron cells of the vertex. Basically, they could extract certain signals and study its characteristics. That's a wonderful work, and that in a sense has motivated the entire domain of convolutional neural networks, to say with. So that particular video is here. You people can go through that. Then apart, like there's a wonderful video lecture by Andrew Ng on convolutional neural networks that is available publicly. So we all can refer these material from the available internet resources. Now, having said that, let's come to the field of deep learning. Why people are intrigued, or why there is such a buzz created around this particular domain. As such, like we all know that AI related problems, that is the artificial intelligence related problems, which were so easy for a biological creature to handle, starting from insects, worms, to all the way to the humans. So we can handle a lot of AI related problems, and it comes at ease to us for all we biological creatures. So one of the fundamental uh, uh, block which enables us to do all these goes directly to the brain, right? So brain, so whatever we can handle with reference to this brain, of course, brain is not a entity on its own, basically. In tandem with multiple other organs, it could be all the sensory organs that we have, and the transmission channels that we have inbuilt in our body, makes this brain a wonderful thinking machine, right? So when I say thinking, there are a lot of other aspects involved in this brain, so that we can perceive a pattern, we can analyze a speech, we can look at an image and say what is that object is, right? And also we can estimate certain distance, and we can sense the smell of an object. Basically, we can touch and feel the object. So all these wonderful things are all inbuilt, and that comes so naturally to us as a biological creature. So starting from those days, as the technologies were introduced, and starting from the days of calculator, humans and scientific fraternity, uh, they they were of this opinion: if calculator or computing machines can crunch this amount of data, so then it can do much better than what we humans can do. So why don't we emulate the intelligence aspects of biological creatures on missions? So that's the very motivation with which the whole area of this AI started. But soon people realized it's not a easy walk, right? So soon people realized that's not an easy problem to solve. Uh, Computation is an altogether a different ball game compared to the AI related problems. So AI related problems were still a challenge. Believe me, not long ago, even 5 years, 6 years, or 10 years back, people wouldn't have believed that we could attain certain aspects of AI on the missions. Now, all that is put behind us, there are certain specific tasks at which the missions can equally perform to the level of humans. At times, like they are better off than humans. When I'm saying this, I'm pretty cautious on telling you about this. That in a very narrow perspective, in a very narrow objectives, these algorithms can outbeat humans. But to exaggerate, this AI will take over the humans, will take over all these biological creatures one fine day. It's not anywhere near basically. So because the mere complexity of the biological organs, and still we are unable to decipher how exactly these organs work, especially with reference to the brain. Hardly we have actually delved deep into how actually the brain works. It's only at the peripheral level we know how it works, and with that limited knowledge, we are trying to construct a very narrowed down version of that particular thought process called as deep learning or artificial neural networks, which has become a main source of solution for the AI related problems. So having said that, what all different applications that are possible today using this deep learning to solve those AI problems? So now if we just look at that, almost long back, a decade back, the deep learning algorithm was able to beat the best of best chess champion out there, right? So then now there are particular versions of these deep learning algorithms called as generative adversarial networks, or the GAN networks, which are proficient enough to generate certain kind of data which we humans fail to even recognize if they're real or the one which are generated by the machine. Say, for example, this particular face is all synthesized by the generative adversarial networks, and we as humans, we won't be able to say whether it is a real face or the imaginary face that is generated by the neural network. So things have become so realistic in a sense. So then DeepMind, I mean, the, in the year 2011, the deep learning algorithm could beat the most complex and most intelligent game on earth called as game Go. And that's where these Asians took a notice of that. Like when a company like an IBM or a Google can devise certain algorithms which can outbeat or outperform humans' ability to play smart games, that's when they took notice of it, especially China. So from that year on, that is 2012, they heavily invested on this artificial intelligence, and now, in fact, like they're one of the global leaders as a country. In fact, like people do say, like almost like they're on par with certain aspects with the Americans, or they've even outbeaten them in certain aspects of this AI related problems, because they have crunched a lot of data, so which no country on this globe can even imagine. I mean, they've created a huge amount of data, right? So then, be it like robotics or be it like biomedical applications. So starting from analyzing the patterns in EEG, ECG signals, all the way down to sensing a cancerous cell on a mammogram image. So you just name it, like the deep learning algorithms have engulfed most of the problems that we were dealing, all the way starting from rule based approaches to the data-driven approaches like the DL as of now. Yeah. So then, what best complex thing that you can think of, basically driving a car in an autonomous sense, and imagine the kind of complexity that is involved. And for all these, now we have a solution. There is a self-driving car. In the background, they make use of all these deep learning algorithms. So almost like most of the domains are not even thinkable without this deep learning nowadays. So what made it so, the very structure of it and the kind of performance improvement that people achieved using this deep learning algorithm led to this. But we as scientists and engineers, we should be away from creating too much of hype around the topic. Having said that, there are still unsolved problems. There are still the problems which are not solvable using even deep learning. So we should not get bogged down by all those hype. Hype is hype. It's there for something else, to attract kids, to attract students, to attract fundings. But we as scientists and engineers have to be grounded, and we have to work towards the achievement of the goals and objectives. So now, where does the deep learning sits? Say, for example, as I said, all energy and orientation is towards solving the AI related problems. So can I actually mimic the biological creature's ability on mission? So can be broadly defined as the AI. And AI definition per se keeps varying. It's not static definition. So starting from the days of calculator, computing would have been the AI problem. But now no more computing is an AI problem, right? Computing is more of a logical problem which can be emulated on the machines, and that's not a big deal as of now. We know, like some of the supercomputers data crunching ability, nowhere we can compare it to the human's ability of computing. We are far behind such kind of computations, right? But we have other innate abilities which machines don't have as of now. That is what we are trying to emulate on the machines. So all such different problems can be categorized as the AI related problems. So in fact, like even prior of introducing this machine learning concept, there were all rule-based approaches people used to solve the problems of speech recognition, natural language processing, or biomedical analysis of a given signal through a rule-based approaches. So if it would have been a one-dimensional signal, we used to conventionally apply the signal processing techniques to extract certain features. So post that extraction of those features, we used to connect the rules, we used to induce the rules to tackle the given problem and arrive at the solution. Now, soon people who were working on these rule-based approaches did realize that nowhere it's possible to even match or even to get a comparable performance to that of a humans. That's where it didn't take off in a big manner. Then post that came all the data-driven approaches like ML-based algorithms. So there are many classification algorithms, there are many regression algorithms that are there as part of this ML. So that came into picture. So compared to rule-based approaches, soon the people realized that if we tend to train certain data-driven algorithms, they can outbeat the performance of the rule-based approaches, and we can get the solutions which are near partially equal to the humans' performance, but still it was lacking and not reached to the kind of performance what we were expecting. Some problems we got the solution using ML, but some problems never took off, and it was of no big commercial interest, nor it was of a big scientific interest as far as those problems were concerned. Now, post this introduction of this DL algorithm, things got changed. So at least in a very narrow definition of those AI related problems, these DL algorithms could give the kind of solutions which were comparable to that of the humans, or at best, like they could be outperforming in some of those applications. So just not the credit that goes to the evolution of the algorithms or evolution of the methodologies, but there are other aspects of the technology which made this quite a possible task, right? So coming to this literature, it's not that like people do get confused when I say the artificial intelligence is a very new topic. It's not so. So these AI related problems are existing in the scientific world from even our pre-independence era. To be frank, like one of the earliest paper was published in year 1943. So even it was earlier to our independence, right? So that's when one of the first earliest paper came into the literature. It had its own drawback. It didn't had the uh, it didn't had the learning capabilities. It didn't had a powerful learning algorithms to train that particular neural network. That's the reason it didn't take off in a big way. But nevertheless, having the constant progression with reference to the different algorithms, starting from all the way from 1943 to the extent of 2020, basically there's a whole lot of progress that is achieved in terms of the literature. There's an excellent literature. And there are excellent algorithms which led way to the current context of deep learning, starting from that stochastic gradient descent algorithm. We know what is this gradient descent algorithm is all about. I need to find the optimal weights of a given neural network or a given ML algorithm. So how can I find that? Like it's an iterative algorithm using which I keep fine tuning my weights and biases of the given neural network using the gradient descent algorithms. And there are several variants to the basic version of the gradient descent algorithm that was proposed in the year 1952. Some of them are a momentum gradient descent algorithm, Nestro gradient, Nestro accelerated gradient descent algorithms. Then came like adaptive gradient descent algorithm, that is ADAGRAD. Then came RMS prop. Then came then came the Adam optimizer. So there are several variations to that particular algorithm. So each has got its own pros and cons, starting from the days of 1952. So then, having said that, as I said, one of the earliest algorithm didn't had a learnable weights as far as that algorithm is concerned. Then a proposal came in the year 1958 called as perceptron learning law, or perceptron, basically, or we also generally tend to call that as multi-layer perceptron, all the way to the 1986. So many powerful algorithms came wherein using these we could adapt the weights as per the objectivity of that particular application is concerned. So backpropagation is one of the most powerful learning algorithm that we do have in the current day context, using which we can adapt the weights. So in what sense we can adapt the weights? So generally make use of the gradient descent to adapt the weights using this backpropagation algorithm. Yeah. So then all the way, one of the earliest convolutional neural network that was proposed in the year 1995 was generally confined to the digit recognition, which is a simpler task compared to finding a tumor in a cancerous image, basically. That, thanks to the kind of rich literature that we have in the scientific domain, apart from that, the data sets and mind it, like all these, most of the algorithms what I'm talking, they're all data driven. In a sense, we do require the data to train those algorithms. Then apart, the data has to be labeled, and most of these algorithms what I'm talking about are all supervised based approaches. Of course there are unsupervised based approaches as well, but still it is a thing in doing. Basically, most reliable deep learning algorithms to solve some of the complicated AI problems are all in the supervised category. That's where we do require large amounts of data, and apart, like the data has to be labeled, right? Or annotated, right? So that's what is essential when we want to deal with these algorithms. And thanks to the progress of the internet world, and now we have a rich amount of data in all disciplines, starting from biomedical or medical domain to the industrial sector. We do have large amounts of data that is collected by different segments, be it industry, manufacturing, production, or research. So we do have large amounts of data in each of these domains. I mean, I'm sorry to say, unfortunately, we Indians are not so good at like maintaining such powerful databases. Coming to any of those fields, we do lack that structured way of creating the data. Even today, we do rely on data sets that are created by Chinese, Europeans, and Americans. Very hard to come up with some rich, large data sets that are created by we Indians, right? We do have such kind of data sets, except for few things. We don't have such large amounts of data. So collecting large amounts of data is quite a critical component, which we ignore, be it whatever the field. Uh, uh, we have to go for it, else there is no way we'll be left out in the race of this AI, basically. So then came a powerful improvement in terms of the hardware, thanks to the GPUs, that is graphics processing units. The original intention of this GPU was not to actually handle these deep learning. By accident, some university research graduates, they found out that running deep learning algorithms uh, on these graphics processing units is highly efficient, and we can distribute the computing of this highly computationally intensive deep learning algorithms on GPUs so efficiently that it can increase the training time by multifold. So thanks to the GPUs, so we have very powerful GPUs in the market, and it's not that costly, unlike supercomputers, right? So we as researchers, we can't afford to always go for the supercomputers the way big companies can afford or big research labs can afford. So thanks to this GPUs, at least with few lakhs, like we can procure a GPU based machine nowadays, and anybody can start working on that. Typically somewhere around 5 to 10 lakhs, all the way up to crores. Together, we do have different ranges of GPU based machines, and one can procure and start working on these algorithms. And not only with reference to the improvement of the hardware, then came the improvement in terms of software, and we need not reinvent the wheel every time we do design certain applications, right? So if I say convolutional neural network, there should be certain libraries which I should be using and rigging up a network and go on to design different applications. So thanks to all the existing libraries, so there are multiple toolkits that are available, and it's all open source. One can use and build the applications quite easily. To name some of them is the MATLAB, which we are familiar with. We can utilize them to design deep learning algorithms. Then apart from that, we do have open source resources, especially with reference to Python packages called as Caffe, TensorFlow. On top like this, it's the libraries to build the network so easily called as PyTorch, and many other tools are there as of the software is concerned. So now the culmination of all these different components, what I've said in this slide, has enabled to go for real challenging problems which were thought like not solvable, as all of a sudden become approachable, right? So that's the difference all these different components has brought. So feel free to stop me anytime and ask questions if you feel like so. We can have discussions. It need not be to the end of the session. So then it didn't happen all of a sudden. All that, like I was saying, there's an ImageNet challenge classification which is thrown to the public every year, and any scientific groups can participate in this one and say like what is the error rate with reference to this image classification, right? So I mean this competition was there, of course. If we just look at the 2010, so the best classification error that was there was somewhere in the 28.2% classification error. So then as the years progress, we can see that there is the dip in the error. So in the year 2011, the error was 25.8%. Now, something happened post this 2011. We just look at this. There's a sudden drastic decrease with reference to the error rate. So almost there is an improvement of 10%, right? Approximately. So this 10% improvement is the one which the scientific community took a great notice of it. And what contributed to that reduction of the 10% error was thanks to the neural network. So all this while the ML algorithms were ruling the were dominating the scene, and post the 2011, basically the convolutional neural network came into picture, and there was a drastic reduction in terms of the error rate, which came close to 16%, right? And post that, like 11 and 14 and 2015, we can just notice that it is 3.57. So there's a huge reduction of error starting all the way from 2010 to 2015. So this 5 years, something miracle happened, yeah, right? And thanks to the deep learning, so the error rate, if I ask humans to label the objects in a given images, so perhaps it would be somewhere around 5.1 on an average, basically. Whereas these algorithms are highly reliable than the humans' performance. That's when we say the algorithms can outbeat the performance of humans in a very narrow sense, right? So what led to this? These are some of the algorithms that led to these kind of results. Basically, it started with the 2012, as I said. It is the first convolutional neural network which won the competition. Basically, it had 8 layers, and it had nearly 61 million parameters to fine tune. Then came 2013, which is called as ZFNet, and then a famous architecture called as VGG, which was introduced in the year 2014, had a 19-layer neural network. So then in the year 2014 came the GoogleNet, which had 5 million parameters to be tuned in this network. Then you can see that in the year 2015, the ResNet, which has 152 layers of neural network. One trend is common. If you just notice, as the time is progressing, you can see more number of layers being stacked. So that's the difference. Now we have the data crunching power with us, thanks to the hardware and software, efficient software that is designed, and now we'll be able to handle very complex networks, and that enables us to improve the results of these kind of challenges that we have. So what makes a convolutional neural network, and what is it is all about, is what we'll try to find out. The convolutional neural networks basically are designed to handle the grid structured data. So when I say grid structured data, it has one significant property for this grid structured data. It has got strong spatial dependencies. A high degree of correlation exists between the adjacent data points. So one of the most obvious example for grid structured data, coming to the two-dimensional representation, is the image data. So image is one such example for the grid structured data. Having said that, these neural networks are not just confined to the image data. So any of these grid structured data can be handled using these kind of neural networks. Then, of course, add a different volume to the existing data of dimension. When I say 2-dimension, it is with reference to x, y coordinates, which represents the pixel of a given image, and add one more dimension of color to this, that becomes a volume, right? That becomes a volume, 3-dimensional volume. So then apart, like we can also think to an extent of 4-dimensional data as well. Take this 3-dimensional volume data and add one more independent variable to this data, that is the time. So we can think of four-dimensional data. So anything beyond this fourth-dimensional data becomes difficult to imagine. But having said that, we can keep creating multiple dimensions for the given data. Say, for example, not only image, I can also add audio data to this. That becomes one more aspect of a given data, right? So then you can add smell, you can add touch, right? So you can keep on adding different element of elements of information for the given data, and you can keep creating higher dimensional aspects of a given data. But imagination beyond three dimension becomes difficult for us to comprehend. Then one of the important property of image data is that, like, they're all translational invariants. In a sense, you just take that image, you flip it, you turn it. Still, we as humans can easily say, like, what is the object in a given image. So that is one inherent characteristics of a given image. And the same, if we want to expect in a artificial neural networks, then convolutional neural networks is the answer for it. So this also has the similar property of translational invariance and also the size invariance. So many such properties are there as far as this network, that makes it so well fit for the given image classification or image related problems. Um, So, in fact, amongst the deep learning algorithms, there are many deep learning algorithms. It's not that, like, only we have convolutional neural network. We do have a fully connected neural network. We have a time sequential network, like LSTMs, long short-term memory networks. We've got RNN, recurrent neural networks. We've got time delay neural networks. So there are many types of neural networks. As I said in the earlier slide, there is a network called as generative adversarial networks. So each catering to different types of problems. We have different kinds of networks, and each of them forms a deep learning algorithm. So one of the earliest success stories of a deep learning algorithm was the convolutional neural network. And thanks to this field, thanks to this new algorithm, which showed the power of these deep learning algorithms to solve the AI problem, right? Which we saw exactly. Now, what is this convolutional neural network? In the broad sense, it makes use of the hierarchical feature engineering. And precisely speaking, this is the motivation that is inspired by the biological work that was carried by Hubel and Wiesel. Which is, I mean, our brain also does handle the data in a hierarchical fashion. So similar inspiration is all drawn towards this artificial neural networks called as the CNNs, and that's the reason perhaps, like, it's working fine for visual data problems. Yeah. So as I said, the CNNs are biologically motivated. So let's see ourselves, like, how it is motivated, in what way we drew the inspiration to design such kind of network. Basically, the earliest motivation, the early the convolutional neural network that was proposed was all motivated by the cat's visual cortex study that was conducted by Hubel and Wiesel. So what is this visual cortex is? Visual cortex is a small region of neuron cells that are there as part of the brain, which are sensitive to certain visual patterns. Basically, we can call so that as, and how it is, we'll see. Yeah. So specific areas of visual field. So visual field is a field is the one which actually exists in the eye. Basically, if it gets excited, then those cells in the visual cortex will be activated. So that was the famous study carried in Wiesel, and certain shape and orientation actually triggers the activity in the cells, basically. So that's one of the brilliant works that was carried, and we'll see how does that gets excited by, basically. So this is the kind of lab setup they worked in the 1960s. they were able to set up this kind of laboratory and study the cat visual cortex. These are the two gentlemen who did that experiment at Harvard University. And this was that famous paper published in the year 1959 by D.H. Hubel and T.N. Wiesel at Baltimore, at the university. Called, the paper is called as Receptive Fields of Single Neurons in the Cat Striate Cortex. So if possible, and if you people are interested in this domain, I suggest you people to read this paper, and it's an excellent, well-written paper. It gives a lot of insights about our brain and its working, perhaps, like though it's restricted to the visual, and we can draw certain similarities for other domains as well. Yeah. So having said that, this is how the structure looks like. Basically, we do have the sensory organ, that is eye over here, and we do have retina. Then we do have a point called as a fovea. So that in turn gets connected to the nerve, optic nerve. Basically, this helps transmit the data that gets accumulated by these sensors over to the point called as thalamus over here. And the information is all aggregated at the thalamus, and there's a fiber-like structure, the axons, basically gets connected to the back of the brain called as the visual cortex. And this is a small region in the brain which is responsible to find out the patterns in the visual from the visual sensor. Basically, this is where the actual recognition, feature extraction, all those things happens, basically. And this part of the brain is called as the visual cortex. And this is how the connections are there as far as the eyes, the visual field, and there's an optic nerve, as I said, and there's a crossover from left eye to the right eye, basically. So that point is called as optical chiasma. And the thalamus part, like one of the most important organ in that region, is the lateral geniculate nucleus, where the information is aggregated. And so the fibers gets connected, the axon fibers gets connected to the primary visual cortex. The information is transmitted from this point to the primary visual cortex. So here where the actual sensing of different patterns takes place, and eventually we'll be able to recognize the object itself. Yeah. So the fundamental unit which helps us to carry out this information from one end to another end is the neuron. Basically, this is how a neuron looks like. So we do have a finger-like structure called as dendrites. They're all the branches which receives the neurochemical transmission signal from other neurons, and it's like a branch-like structure. You can see that, and all these data that gets collected through the neurochemical transmission basically gets aggregated at the cell body or the soma of a given neuron. The information that gets aggregated triggers the transmission of signal from this point to the other end of the neuron. Again, you can see the branch-like structure called as axon terminal, which in turn gets connected to other sets of neurons. Now, there's a whole network of these neurons which helps us to realize different patterns in the given data. It could be visual, it could be audible, it could be sense, it could be touch, right? So there are different types of data we perceive and process the data and analyze the patterns that are there in the given data, right? So this part of transmission is called as the axon. This is the tube-like structure you can see, and there's a myelin sheath on top of those. And basically, thanks to the chemical ionic chemical exchange that happens, that helps us to transmit the signal from one end to another. So essentially speaking, we do have sodium and potassium ions, and there are ionic channels thanks to them, and based on the signal that gets aggregated in the cell body does open up the channel for the ionic transmission to happen between external body of the cell to the internal, and back from internal to external. So at the resting potential, the electric potential of this neuron is at minus 70 millivolts approximately, somewhere around. And if the stimulation of that signal is so large and it crosses certain threshold, then this neuron gets fired or triggered basically. So once it gets triggered, there's a huge rise in the potential towards the positive side. So then it reaches a peak, and then back it comes to the resting state. This is the process that gets carried in order to transmit the signal from one end to the other end, and this is the fundamental unit which actually handles the data. Now, having said that, what was the experimental setup that Hubel and Wiesel did basically to study this visual cortex? This is how the cat was made laid basically. So it was all tied. I think like it was immobilized, if I'm correct. And then they inserted the electrode to neuron cells basically, and studying different regions of this visual cortex did enable them that they got to know that different layers of neurons are perhaps responsible for finding different patterns of the visual stimulus. Say, for example, this is the kind of visual stimulus one can give it to the eyes of a cat, basically. So here we can see the orientation of the stimulus is horizontal pattern, and this is little angled, and coming close towards the vertical stimulus and back forth to that horizontal. If you just look at that, this particular neuron electrode, by accident, these two people got to know that like certain neurons are sensitive to certain orientations of the stimulus. Say, for example, the one cell they studied had sensitivity for the vertical stimulus. Likewise, they kept on studying different cells from different regions of this visual cortex, and they found out that different cells are responsible and sensitive to different orientations of the stimulus. So this was that famous study carried by these two gentlemen that led to the motivation for the current convolutional neural networks. So in the year 1981, these two people got Nobel Prize for this kind of study that they carried, and they published the paper, and they shared their Nobel Prize with Roger W. Sperry, which he received for a different domain altogether. Yeah. So now, keeping this as a motivation, Fukushima, so from NHK Broadcasting Science Research Laboratory, and say Miyake from Tokyo, they came up with the network called as neocognitron. Basically, this was the earliest version of the convolutional neural network. If we just tend to simplify that convolutional neural network, this is what it boils down to. It's called as the neocognitron. This was the first neural network, and this was heavily motivated by the work carried out by Hubel and Wiesel. So based on that, they drew that motivation and designed a network to handle this visual pattern or the visual data, basically. What was this neocognitron was? Let's see that. So basically speaking, as I said, the visual cortex has got the layers of cells which are responsible for analyzing different patterns of the stimulus. Likewise, the network was also designed to have a hierarchical structure. In a sense, there was something called as the input layer, so which we can regard this as a sensory organ in a human visual system. Then came the secondary layers, and these are called as the intermediate layers, or we can also call them as the hidden layers. So basically, they do take the data that is given by this input layer, and they analyze basic patterns of the given data. When I say basic patterns, for a given object, like it will have certain orientation, right? This is angle, this is horizontal, there might be vertical lines. So all these different basic patterns are analyzed in this particular layer. Then subsequently take those basic patterns, join them to form a higher abstract level pattern, basically. Once we're able to form that abstract level pattern, so then feed that abstract pattern, and depending on the number of classes we do have, let's say our objective is to recognize 26 characters of the English alphabet. If so is my objective, then here we may expect this particular output layer to have 26 different nodes. So why those 26 numbers? Basically, so each node gets triggered by a specific pattern, basically. Right? So perhaps, say for example, if it is the pattern A, then this particular node gets excited. So likewise, if it is a pattern Z, so some other node which is responsible for that uh, output gets triggered. Now this is how we will be able to get what is this pattern that is being fed as an input to this given network. That's how these neural networks are able to recognize what pattern it is. So I've just drew the analogy starting from the neural visual cortex all the way down to this kind of artificial neural network, which is responsible to find out the characters, so which was proposed in the year 1982, called as the neocognitron. Now if we just want to see, yeah, as I said, if it is pattern B, some other node of the output layer gets triggered, and that's where we get to know what is the pattern is, right? So this is the general way that each of these hierarchical layers do handle. So as we notice here, there are some basic shapes of a given pattern, given entire object, basically, right? So these are some of the basic shapes. Now you take all those basic shapes and connect them to form that abstract pattern, that almost like you would have reconstructed the kind of pattern that is being fed as an input, right? But in a statistical sense, in a very abstract sense, right? So this is the pattern A. Now obviously when I feed this kind of uh, uh, thing that is being extracted by this particular layer to the output layer, so one node gets triggered where other 25 doesn't get, basically. When I say triggered, it's again in the probabilistic sense, right? So probabilistically, this is the character that is being supposed to be fed as an input. So in that sense, we'll be able to classify in a loose sense, right? It's a soft decision. It's not a very hard decision that we take at the output layer. Yeah. So this is how the layers were represented in a hierarchical. This is called as the hierarchical information processing. So unlike of course, we were doing it conventionally. What we used to do, we used to apply the pre-processing techniques. We used to apply the filtering technique to eliminate the noise. Then we used to apply the segmentation. Then post that segmentation, we used to apply the classification algorithm in order to classify the pattern. Now all those blocks, all those different blocks that were there in the engineering way of handling the problem, now has been replaced by one single block called as the neural network. And again, that neural network has got different layers of handling this data. This is what we call it as the hierarchical information processing in a layered fashion. So if we just broadly term and relate it to the current context of convolutional neural network, basically, we can just see that there is an input pattern or the input layer that gets connected to the feature extraction layer, which basically extract the basic level features. And as I move on towards the right of that output layer, basically a higher level of layers do extract abstract information rather than the fundamental features, basically. So, and in between them, there is something called as the pooling cells or the C cells, basically. So this was the neocognitron way of handling the things. There's something called as S cells, which were mainly responsible for extracting those features, and there was something called as C cells, which aggregated this data and formed some sort of abstractness of those basic patterns from the feature layers, called as the pooling layers, called as C cells in case of neocognitron. And eventually the last layer was the one which was responsible to classify the input pattern, basically. So this was how this neocognitron was related to the deep convolutional neural network, just specifically for the visual pattern recognition. Now, Very similarly, the convolutional neural network, the current day convolutional neural network, does extract the basic level features to begin with in a hierarchy. Then post that, the middle layers basically are responsible to aggregate the information from those basic level of features and create an intermediate abstract of a given object. Say perhaps if face identification is my objective, it tends to construct the eyes, nose, ears. So it's study that kind of abstractness of a given data, then aggregate all these information and create the face itself basically at higher layers of the neural network. So broadly, you can divide the layers of the convolutional neural network into the basic feature levels, the middle level abstract features, and the higher level abstract features, and post that comes the output layer. So this is how we can broadly define the convolutional neural network in a very simplistic sense. So coming to the edges, people who would have worked on the vision or the image perhaps are familiar with, but for people who are not so familiar with, like, what do we mean by the edges of a given image? Speaking strictly, they're all the high frequency components of a given image. So that's where the entropy lies, and that's what our visual system, when I say visual system, not only the sensory, but also the sensing aspects of the brain, when they randomly work, actually they cling on to these high frequency components of a given visual data, because edges are the one which bears a lot of information. That's where we can help distinguish different objects, sizes, shape, and be it whatever, right? So how do we detect these edges, and what are the properties of these edges are basically? So what are these edges? Edges are nothing but the sudden changes of sudden change of information in a given image, right? So they're the lines or the points of discontinuities in the given image. So there's a significant transition that happens from one pixel to another pixel basically. So that those points is what we call it as the edges. You just connect all those pixels that forms a pattern, that forms a line, that forms different geometric lines basically. It could be straight, it could be curved, be whatnot basically, but the primary element of features as far as this image are concerned are all straight edges. So it could be horizontal, it could be vertical, it could be diagonal. So then connect all these different edges basically, which helps to integrate shape information in our minds basically. Yeah. So what helps us to extract these features in our early days of image processing? These were some of the operators that we used to have in order to extract the edges basically from a given image. Say here we do have Privet, Sobel, and different Laplacian operators, and so forth and so on. There are plenty of such operators that are there in the scientific papers. So all these operators basically helps us to extract the edges from a given image. So let's look at the fundamental aspect of how does this happen basically. So let's take a 6x6 sized image, and we know like the fundamental unit of that image is all nothing but the pixel. So if it is a grayscale image, the dimension of that image would be 6x6x1, right? So if it is a colored image, we all know that the colored image is made up of three different basic components called as red, green, and blue. So henceforth, the dimensionality of the data, now it's no more 6x6x1, but it is 6x6x3. So what those three represents basically, it's the three matrices of size 6x6, and each matrix basically represent the fundamental color, that is RGB. So we do mix up different composition of these basic element colors of RGB and go on to construct large number of colors that we can see in a colored image. So with this trick, I'll just take 2 minutes of break. If you people have any questions, let me just listen to you. Any questions? Yeah, Mr. Puneet Kumar Singh. Yeah, please.
Good morning. Hello.
Good morning. Yeah.
Yeah, sir. Sir, how to implement these CNN networks, sir, based on image stream?
I'll tell you towards the end of this session, if time permits, I do have other half an hour to 45 minutes. I'll take you to the implementation as well, how one can start basically. I'll also take
What
you over
is
there.
the difference between when you go for pattern recognition and image? Both are similar?
Sorry, can you ask the
Here,
question again?
here you said about pattern recognition, right?
Uh-huh.
Is there any difference between pattern recognition for letters and image?
No, after all, those letters can also be represented in the form of image, right?
Yeah, but
Eventually, what we are processing is the image, basically.
yeah, my question is here letter is having like its alphabet, right?
Hmm.
So when I move on to medical images like X-ray, MRI,
Hmm.
what is the difference? How to apply for this? Whether we can apply the same pattern recognition for the images, or is there any different techniques?
Basically, when we talk about this X-ray based images or MRI, any of those images, right? So we can still go ahead and use the similar architectures, and literature have used the similar architectures to handle biomedical images as well. There, even if we tend to call that as a biomedical images, there again the basic ingredients are the edges, the lines. So those are the one which actually forms the shape of a cell, shape of an object, basically, even in the biomedical images, right? So we can essentially use the similar techniques on the biomedical images as well. But only problem with the biomedical images, we may not have these amount of data on the biomedical images. Say here, when we talk about the object recognition, object detection, we do have millions of images in the Kaggle site. So that many images we may not have in the biomedical images, but there is a way to handle that. So you can use all these generic data, so millions of images that we do have, and train the convolutional neural network layers, basically, which helps us to extract those features. Then use that trained convolutional neural network, takes small amount of data. There is something called as transfer learning.
Okay.
So what do we mean by that transfer learning? The convolutional neural network is essentially combination of convolutional layers and also the fully connected layer. So retain convolutional layers as it is and knock off the fully connected layer and try to train that fully connected layer by that small amount of data that you have. That helps us to actually address the small amount of data. So in sense of biomedical data as well. Yeah. Hope I've answered the question.
Yes, sir. Can I know the difference between CNN and transfer learning? Whether both are same?
No, no, no. Transfer learning is a concept that is used in many deep learning techniques. We can use the transfer learning in CNN as well. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Then in another question, how to increase our accuracy? I have went through a lot of papers like CNN based for TB direction.
Hmm.
So, can you suggest me any how to increase the accuracy level in what way? Whether we can change the layer in CNN to increase the accuracy, or is there any other way to?
Yeah. So there
Uh,
are there are many ways we can help improve the accuracy. Uh, One is that the first straight answer would be increase the data size.
increase?
increase increase the data size
Okay.
as much as possible. I mean there's no end to it, basically. That is
So
one thing.
if we have a less amount of data, what will be drawback for doing the project?
But that again, it's a broader topic. Like we do have ML based algorithms, like say support vector machines and so forth and so on. If you just look at the performance versus the amount of data, basically, if we have very less amount of data, still ML based algorithms outbeats the DL based algorithms. But there is a crossover point beyond which where the deep learning algorithms start dominating over the ML based algorithms. Hope I've answered the question.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So we can apply this less amount of data using transfer learning.
Yeah, that's the usual way. So you take the pre-trained neural networks that are already trained with lots of data, millions of images. You will get it. Like I said right.
Sir, whether
There's-
we can change the layer in pre-trained network, like when we go for Google Net, AlexNet, when we change the layers available in pre-trained,
Mhm.
we can get more accuracy. Is
Yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah. That is what is transfer learning is. Knock off the. I mean, the layers you need to knock off is at the towards the output layer, not at the beginning, basically.
Okay, sir.
Yeah,
Sir,
you need to flush those learned weights and introduce the new set of weights.
okay. Sir, can I have your email ID and contact number? Actually, right now I am a PhD scholar in doing medical imaging. So can
Yeah,
you
yeah, yeah,
suggest
yeah.
me?
I'll share you the mail ID. I'll share you
Yeah,
the
can
mail.
you guide me in doing this deep learning based image processing thing? If possible? Is any-
Yeah, yeah. I'll share the mail ID.
Okay.
But I'm not working on the biomedical data.
Okay, sir.
Hmm.
Just I need in convolution neural network. I need some guidance from your side, sir, for my
Yeah,
thesis.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You can mail me. Yeah, Puneet Kumar, you raised your hands. Mr. Puneet Kumar Singh. Yeah. If there are no questions, then we can go back. So as I said, like that also adds in volume to the given data. If it is RGB channels, what we're considering. Let's go by the simple case. Like let's take that 6x6x1 to begin with. Let's say this is the image, and these are the pixel values that I have in a given image. Let's take this and see what exactly that happens in the CNN. So what does that happen? How do I detect the edge, basically? So how do I detect that edge? How do I detect that vertical edge to begin with? So I have a 3x3 matrix over here, which I tend to call that as a convolutional neural network filter. So we can call that as a filter, or even we can call that as a kernel. So any of these things you can see in the literature. So then take that filter and do a convolution operation on these 6x6 pixels that I have. So the convolutional operation is all represented by the star, which is an asterisk symbol, which do represent the convolution operation. So what is that convolution operation with reference to image? So take this particular 3x3 mask. These are all the set of coefficients I have for a filter. Place that filter on top of this particular image in this shape and orientation, then perform the sum of products, basically sum of products, and this is the sum of products. Like once I place that mask on top of this image, basically. So then you do that sum of product, and the resulting value will be -5. So place that value of -5 over here. Now the next set is all obtained by take this orange color mask and just right shift it by 1 pixel. So then how does the mask sits? Basically now the mask sits in this place, basically. So do the same sum of products and you get a value of -4. So then take that orange mask and slide it by one more position. This is called a sliding, right? Slide it by 1 pixel is called as the stride, which is equal to 1, right? If I do slide it by 2 position, then stride will be equal to 2, right? So I can adopt any of these stride factor in a given convolution process. That's anyway, that's a different matter altogether. So complete that, come to this end, basically, then move that, go to the left again, move it by down, so that you just take a mopping cloth and just mop it around the image. That's what exactly I'm doing. So that mopping has to happen in a logical sense. So shift right by 1 pixel when you're moving towards the right position, and once you reach the end of the floor, you just come back to the beginning of the floor to the left corner, but now you're shifted down by 1 pixel. So it's a logical mapping of the whole image basically that happens. So post that mapping, like that mapping operation is what we call it as the convolution basically. There's a two-dimensional convolution. People who have worked on single dimensional signal, we know what is the convolution operation is all about. So we do get the convolved image. Now I've taken the filter, I've convolved it, I got an output image. Like, so this output image, in a sense, if there are any vertical edges, basically, I would have extracted using this convolution mask. Yeah. So just take that kind of image, which is 6x6 here in this case. Take this vertical edge detector operator, which is a filter here in this case, do the convolution operation, and we do get the convolved image. And this strip of line basically, which is a light shade compared to the dark shade which are adjacent to it, this basically indicates that there is a white line. If there is a white line, that is an indication of that there is an edge, basically vertical edge. If there is a vertical edge, it emerges out post the convolution. So likewise, I can just take this vertical filter and just flip it in the way that is shown here and create an horizontal edge detector. Yeah, right. So then you can construct different kinds of masks and different kinds of filters, and it need not be always horizontal and vertical. It can be angled as well. So at least you can construct plus 45 and minus 45. Right. So all these different shapes and symbols can be constructed using this kind of mask. So if you want to construct other inclined lines, which is less than 45, right? Let's say 10, 5, then you need to have a bigger size of the mask. That's it. Yeah. So you can keep on constructing different types of edge related operators. Now, as we noticed in the previous convolution operation, if I take a 6x6 image, convolve it with a 3x3 mask, the size of the output image reduces. So if you keep on stacking up of those 150 layers, what we spoke about, then eventually we'll be left with no pixel at all if the size of output image keeps on reducing. In order to avoid that, there's something called as padding. So you do take all the zeros and append to the end of all the four corners of this image. So thereby we would have constructed a larger size of the given image. And then if we do go and convolve this image, the size of the image remains to be that of the original image. So it won't shrink basically. So this concept is what we call it as the zero padding. So by adding zeros to the end of this particular image, I would have not modified any information of the given image, and henceforth this doesn't impact the output of the given image. Then apart from that, generally what I said, the convolution actually starts at this corner, and this boundary information of the given image is left out. So if we increase the size of the image, and even this boundary will be considered, and certain types of edges will all be taken into consideration. So anyway, this is a zero padding concept to avoid the shrinkage of the given images. Then there is striding, what I said, and there is padding. So if we do include everything into the picture, and this is the mathematical expression of what would be the output image. So I said stride need not be always equal to 1. Stride can be 2, can be 3. Basically, that is beneficial, like when we're handling large amounts of data. It's not quite possible to have a stride factor of 1 and scan through all the convolution process. So that's where this stride factor comes into picture. And if you plug in all the elements of different things, that is here the padding, which is P, if it is 1 0 padding or 2 0 padding or 3 0 padding, depending on that, we can substitute the value of F, and N is the size of the image. F is the filter kernel size. If you plug in all these values, you get like what would be the size of the output image be. We can easily calculate using this relation. Now, we just dealt with 6x6x1 image. What if like we had to deal with the RGB, which essentially consists of 3 different matrices, as I said. which are the fundamental colors of the given object, like basically are the G matrix, and there is a blue matrix. Now, how do I convolve? Now, take the same filter kernel that I designed, but you just replicate into three different matrices of 3 cross 3. Take these individual 3 cross 3 matrices and convolve on each of them, basically. So post that convolution, I do get three matrix three different matrices. So add each element together. You take the average of all these three and place that value over here. So essentially, what you get post that convolution of these RGB is one 4 cross 4 matrix as an output, basically. Likewise, this is what we call it as the convolution over volume. Then not only that, I can have one single edges, I can have multiple such edges, right? I am not only interested in vertical edge, but I also will be interested in horizontal edge. I also will be interested in 45 plus 45 degree. I also will be interested in minus 45 degree. So I can keep on constructing different sets of filters, basically. Now this forms one filter, this forms another filter. Now I do have two different filters. So take this filter, convolve with the RGB, we get one 4 cross 4 matrix. We take another matrix, convolve it with the data, we get another output. So how many such outputs I can expect? Basically, what it depends on? What does it depend on?
Like a binary flash.
No, how many number of outputs I'll get? Like the number of outputs depends on how many filters I have, right? How many such filters I have. If I have 10 filters to convolve for a given image, then I do have 10 such output matrices. Is that point clear? Yeah. So then neural network would have not been a neural network if I would have stopped at the previous slide. So the beauty of the neural network comes with the nonlinear activation function. After all, this is the one which makes neural networks a powerful algorithm, right? So if I keep on stacking multiple layers of linear networks, what essentially we get? Do we get a nonlinear network or a linear network? What do you expect? Keep on stacking different linear layers. You keep on doing convolution operation on linear layers, you get a linear layer as an outcome, right? So if you keep on stacking the linear layers, we won't be able to draw the hyperplanes and boundaries in the hyperplanes to just classify different complex objects. We do require a non-linear boundaries to segregate very complicated data. That's where this nonlinear activation function comes into picture. So we do get this 4 cross 4 matrix as an outcome. And also we do have something called as bias. So you add that bias basically, which is of the form ax plus b form, basically, which is a linear equation. So then pass this through a nonlinear activation function. So there are several nonlinear activation functions that generally people use in the deep learning architecture, called as sigmoid, called as tanh, called as ReLU. There are different types of nonlinear activation functions. Each has got its own pros and cons. Generally speaking, nowadays they stick to this ReLU, rectified linear units, basically. So pass this data onto a nonlinear activation function. Essentially, what we get again is a 4 cross 4 matrix. But now no more the data is a linear output. It is a non-linear output. Why? Because after all, we have passed this thing through a nonlinear function. So this is generally what happens in terms of math equation. So z of 1, this indicates which layer I am in, basically. Weights of the current layer, right, of the layer 1 is all influenced by the input from the previous layer, that is 0th layer, and the bias of the current layer, that is 1. So we do get this output, intermediate output called as z of the layer 1, pass that z of the layer 1 to a nonlinear activation function g. So g here in this case is the ReLU function, and you get the output from the current layer, right? A of 1. Now this acts as an input to the next layer, that is second layer. So that's how the layers get stacked and get interconnected. Now why do we use these kind of functions, nonlinear activation functions? So that goes and gets connected to the gradient descent algorithm. When you back propagate, basically, you need to adapt these weights. Now, how do we adapt these weights? Now, that depends on the gradient descent, right? So by applying partial derivatives, why we have to apply the partial derivatives? Why not I can go for the derivative function? Why we have to go to the partial derivative? What am I interested in, basically? I'm interested in adapting these weights. Now, do you think like there will be one set of weights? I can have a network of one weight, but will it be of great use to me, basically? It's of no significant use to me, right? I need to have a network with lot many neurons, the way our brain has, nowhere close to the brain, but essentially some finite number of neurons, and each of those neurons are nothing but the weighted summation of the inputs, and each of those weights have to be adapted. Now, all these weights are independent, let's say. If so is the case, we have to treat this problem as a multivariable problem, and that's where this partial derivative comes into picture. Now, how much? So, with reference to what we are generating the error curve, how do we generate the error curve? So, as I said, these are all the supervised based techniques. So, they're all labeled. So, when I have a label, I know what is the outcome y is, but whatever the predicted output will all be in the form of y cap. Now, I need to take the difference between the predicted value y cap and to that of the actual output. That's where I get the difference. And that difference will be of certain dimension, right? It won't be a single value. It's not a scalar, it's a vector again, right? So you just plot that error surface with reference to all the weight values that you need to adjust there. You construct error surface curve. Now, in that error surface curve, the objectivity of a neural network is to minimize the error, basically. So I essentially want to find out the R min point, the minimum point in a function, basically. So how do I find that minimum point in a given error surface curve? So that's where I rely on the gradient. So to begin with, I'll start with some random initialization of these weights and then slowly converge towards the minimum point or the global minimum of a given error surface curve. That's where ideally I want to be, basically. So how do I achieve? So I cannot do that in one step, basically. So it should be an iterative number of steps that I need to take on, basically, and then go on to converge to that particular global minimum point. And post that, like number of iterations, if there are no more changes in the weights, no more adaptation of those weights, then you stop at that point and you've attained the convergence, and that you take it as a trained model. So all these things you must be knowing, if at all you people are working in this neural network domain, and if you've studied the multi-layer perceptron, at least to begin with. So I've just quickly summarized the neural network. In case you people don't know that, you begin with those aspects, whatever I've said, right? So now taking this simple convolutional neural network, then let us construct the simple convolutional neural network. So let's say we do have an image which is colored, which has RGB. We have 39 cross 39 cross 3. Now you take this stride, you take this padding, you take the number of filters to be 10, basically, right? So then the filter kernel of the size 3 cross 3, basically. So do that convolution operation, you end up with this 37 cross 37 cross 10. Which is the volume of data. So then again, you apply these parameters. Now, mind it, like there are 20 filters. So now this will be the volume of the data. So then take these parameters, do apply the convolution. You do get 7 cross 7 cross 40, which essentially turns out to be 1960 different points that are there in this given data. So now this is the volume. This we need to convert to a column vector. How do I convert that to a column vector? Take this matrix, unroll it basically, take the first row, put it over here, take the second row, append it over here, take the fourth row and append it over here. Do that for the entire matrix. Then there is one more filter, one more matrix. There are such 40 filters. Stack all of them in this fashion. Eventually, you would have converted a 3-dimensional data to a 1-dimensional column vector, right? So this 1-dimensional column vector is the one which gets connected to the fully connected network. After all, fully connected network is the one which actually helps us to classify the data. So then at the output layer, you have the number of output nodes basically to classify. If suppose this has 26 characters, then you can expect the output layer to have 26 different nodes. If your objectivity is to just classify this particular image as a malignant or non-malignant image, so then you will have 2 nodes or a single node, right, to classify your image into different number of classes. So this is where we call it as the YCAP. So this is the predicted output. Now for each of the fed input image, I have the label. So I know whether it is a malignant or a non-malignant image. So if it is a malignant image, it has certain value. If it is a non-malignant image, it has got certain value. Take the difference with this YCAP, you get the error. Now that error, using that error, I can construct the error surface. So using that error surface, I can backpropagate to this CNN and adapt these weights. Hope I'm clear with these concepts.
How the filter is getting increased and stride also getting increased for what?
Yeah, so it depends on no stride. It's up to us. We need to design basically. We are the one who are actually designing all this. Depending on the problem, whether we want, depending on the nature of the data. So where do we get this information from? From the literature. If I had to start blank, right? So then I need to experiment on all these heuristically, then come up with the optimal figures. But that's not the case, right? We have a literature backup basically. So you name it, like be the medical images, be the general set of images, you name it, like we have the literature over there, right? So somebody has done it already. You take that and adapt those parameters to this one. Hope I'm clear.
Yes, sir. What about you said that ReLU layer, right?
Mm-hmm. ReLU is not a layer. It is a nonlinear activation function for a given neuron.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a layer. Yeah, so then comes the max and average pooling layer for a given neural network. So what is that max pooling is? Take a 2x2 matrix and average out all these values and replace that. Like, so you need to essentially reduce the dimension of the data as well. Then apart from that, like I need to characterize this region. So how do I characterize? It's by using this max or average pooling. Earlier networks essentially made use of average pooling, but of late, like this is very computationally intensive. Henceforth, people do make use of max pooling. So take all these 4 values and find out what is the maximum value in that and put there basically. So apart from the convolutional layers, we do have pooling layers as well. So when I say layer, it's in combination of the convolutional layer combined with that of the pooling one, stack them together to form one layer of a given neural network. That's what we call it as the layer of a given convolutional neural network. Say for example, here convolutional layer 1 and pooling layer 1 combiningly, we call that as a layer 1 basically. So likewise, the second convolutional layer and to that of the second pooling layer combined together, we call that as a layer 2. So then we do have a fully connected layer. This forms the input layer for the fully connected network, and there might be 1 or 2 hidden layers. Then comes the softmax, which acts like an output layer basically. So this is how a convolutional neural network with the pooling layer basically looks like. And most of the architectures that are there in the literature do essentially follow the same flavor, except for the variations in the number of layers and other things. In general sense, more or less the structure remains the same. So one of the earliest convolutional neural network that was proposed was called as ELINet 5 basically. So here, if we tend to feed the image of 32 cross 32 cross 1, which is a grayscale image to this network, it has 28 cross 28 cross 6 basically. So then apply certain f equals 2, stride equals 2, then there comes the average pool basically, which is 14 cross 14 cross 6. You can notice that you've taken a 2 cross 2 size average pool, and that's where the size of the image, size of these rows and columns have been reduced by half, that is 14 cross 14. Then you apply the stride of 1. This is where the convolutional layer comes into picture, that is 10 cross 60, 10 cross 16. There are 16 such filters basically in the ELINet. So then apply the average pool, the size reduces by 5 cross 5 cross 16. Now take this 5 cross 5 cross 16, stack them together to form the column vector, and there's a hidden layer of 84 nodes, and there we get the output YCap basically in the output layer. So this is how ELINet architecture looks like. It has got 5 layers basically. So then comes the AlexNet, which is much more complicated than that of the ELINet 5. So these has got these many parameters stacked together. We have convolutional and max pool. So you can notice that earlier network had the average pool as the pooling layer. Here it has been replaced by the max pool. So that's the difference between the AlexNet and the ELINet. And here onwards, so nobody uses the average pool. Most of them do rely on the max pool. So these are the parameters of the AlexNet. So likewise the VGGNet. So totally it has got 19 layers of network. So as you can notice, like every improvement in the network has stacked many layers. So stacking many layers do help us to handle much more complicated data, much more intricate data, right? So that's the benefits that we can get by stacking up too many layers onto the network. So now how do we build our own network basically? So this is one of the simplest one to begin with. We can start with this MNIST data set, which is a character data set. Digit recognition data set. So they're all handwritten digits varying from 0 to 9. They're all single digit images. There are 60,000 such images, and there are 10,000 such testing images. Then the width of the image is 28 cross 28, and they're all grayscale images. Why we start with this one? Because we need not have any GPU based machine to begin with. We can straight away start experimenting in our laptops. I think that's good enough. It can handle this kind of data. Yeah. So this is the kind of data one can begin with. So how do I start? These are the installation steps. Take that Anaconda. It's very easy to set up the environment. So this is where you can find the Anaconda. Here I've shown 18.04, but you take top of the stack Anaconda repository, install it, and set up the Anaconda environment. I'm just giving you broad steps of setting up it. You can refer any of those videos to set up the Anaconda. Then install Keras. That's one of the simplest ways of implementing the neural networks. PyTorch is also another good library that you people can make use of. Then sklearn environment is all set. Once you've set up the environment, then we can refer this particular website called as Analytics Vidya. This particular website, I'll share the slides. You can refer to these websites. Then run the code. How do I run the code? There are many notebooks. Say Jupyter Notebook is one thing. Likewise, there are many other forms in which like I can run the code, the Python code basically. Yeah. So this is what is a MNIST data set. As I said, 0 to 9 is the handwritten digit data sets. So such 70,000 images are there. We can utilize 60,000 for training and 10,000 images for testing. And we can design a simple fully connected neural network to begin with, and then move on to the convolutional neural network. So there is something called as one hot encoded. I'll not get into that. So you people may browse through different content to get to know what is that one hot encoded is. So then build a model architecture. They're all sequential in nature. Then train the models and make the predictions. So this is how the code looks like. So this is how we can prepare the data set basically. So we have to reshape that and make it a single column data and typecast it to float 32 type and normalize the data basically. So this is all the data preparation stage. And once you've prepared the data stage, then you go on to build the neural network. So type, I'm trying to build the sequential network. The CNN comes in that category of the sequential network. Then you specify the parameters of the given network. So it's a fully connected network that I'm designing now. It's a once I say it is a dense, basically it's a fully connected network. Then it has got 100 nodes in that dense layer, basically in that hidden layer, and it accepts 784. 784 comes from the input size and shape basically, and also you need to include the bias. So then what kind of activation function then that I need to use? I need to use the ReLU activation function. So then there are there is an output layer as well. How many nodes I can have in the output layers? Since I have 0 to 9 as the digital characters, I must have 10 different nodes in a given output layer. Then generally speaking, we don't use the ReLU, we do use the softmax activation, nonlinear activation function as the at the output layer. Now you've designed the network. All that I need to do is I need to train this particular network and then validate the result, right? So likewise, how do I design the convolutional neural network? Basically, this is how I can design the convolutional. I mean, this is all the data preparation part. So this is how I can design the convolutional neural network. Say, for example, 25 such filters basically, and the kernel size is 3x3. Stride, you can say it as 1x1. So valid padding, I think it inserts 1 0 padding. And what is the activation function? That is the ReLU, right? So likewise, you then comes the fully connected network, right? So here I've designed one convolutional layer and one max pool layer. So put together, we have one convolutional neural network layer, right? Then we have to flatten the data post this operation, right? Once we have flattened, that flattening operation is the one which actually helps us to convert the volume of data into a column vector. So now that acts as an input to the dense layer, right? Again, in the dense layer, we do have one hidden layer and one output layer. It's same as that of the earlier case. So this is how the accuracy we can measure. There's something called as validation, training accuracy and the validation accuracy. So if you can just monitor these two numbers, basically, here 94 and 97 keep on converging as the number of iterations goes back. This is what we call it as the epochs, right? So we can design it for several such epochs. Say, for example, if I've run 10 epochs for the given data, already I've attained the validation accuracy of 98%. Generally speaking, this training accuracy and to that of the validation accuracy should come close to each other. They may not be exactly equal, but they have to be close to each other. If not so, then there is a problem called as overfitting or underfitting that we need to take care, depending on whichever is the larger number. So this is how we can train and attain different accuracies for a given convolutional neural network. So with that, like, I'll stop at this point. Hope I've given you the broad context of what is a convolutional neural network is all about, and what is the internal aspects of this convolutional neural network. Keeping this as a basis, I hope like people can apply the same CNNs on top of the biomedical data, biomedical images especially. So with that, like I'll stop at this point. If there are any questions, do let me know. Let's have a discussion for 5 to 10 minutes. Thank you. You can take down the mail ID.
Sir, actually, I have some doubt in fully connected network.
Mm-hmm.
After that flatten layer,
Mm-hmm.
why we are selecting this flatten into column vector?
I mean, the fully connected layer takes the input features which are in the column vector, right? It only accepts the one-dimensional data. It doesn't accept the two-dimensional data, unlike CNN layer.
Yes, in the column vector, we converted that row into column, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is in the flatten.
Mm-hmm.
So the example 1, 2, 3, 4 in that first row of that final output of that pooling layer.
Mm-hmm.
In that pooling layer, we converted that output into column. That is a one, and then second row is two, and third row is like that.
Right.
We converted that and we trained. In
Right.
the training network, we convert. We have that training data. We
Mm-hmm.
take the transform right in that neural network.
No, I didn't get your question, to be frank. Yeah. Can you explain
Okay.
us? Yeah.
Actually, in the flatten,
Mm-hmm.
we converted the row, that is a row, into column.
Mm-hmm.
We converted the row into column to get each input as a single node, single values.
Mm-hmm.
So inside that training part,
Mm-hmm.
in the training part we need some transformation in the neural network, artificial neural networks.
Mm-hmm.
In the fully converted layer,
Mm-hmm.
we transform. We using transformation.
What kind of transformation are you talking about?
In that ANN.
ANN, it's a stack of fully connected neurons, right?
Yes,
We
yes,
do have hidden layers.
yes. And one more thing, yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's the reason I'm confusing in that. In that image, all the things you take as a row in a stacked manner, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why you are selecting all those row in a stacked manner? Why you are not considering the column one?
You can do that as well. You are feeding certain pattern that we have got from the pooling layer. What do we get out of the pooling layer? What do we get?
In the pooling layer, that is a subsampling. We are getting that.
No, it is not subsampling. It's the abstract level of feature that we have extracted from the input data, right?
Yes.
It is the
That
feature.
is the features. Yes.
We are feeding the feature to the fully connected layer.
Yes.
Either you can take it row wise or column wise. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah. You're
So
feeding certain pattern and training your fully connected layer to identify the pattern in a given image.
Okay. No, normally, image in that image processing, that is in the MATLAB or some other things, they consider only the columns, not in the rows.
No. I don't think so. At least as far as I know, I mean, either you can take row wise or column wise. It doesn't matter.
That is 784, right? 28 into 28, we get 784 pixel values. In the pixel values, we trained in the row manner, right?
Yeah.
We trained in the row manner. If
I've told. I mean, this is what like essentially most of the literature follows. I mean, I said it's not strict row sense. I mean, you can also feed that column wise.
Oh, we can do in column wise also.
Yeah. There is no hard and fast rule here.
Okay.
Yeah.
But most of the cases, all the MATLAB or and some other Keras or TensorFlow or some other languages, they are using only the row-wise manner.
Precisely. That's the reason I said that. I mean, but if you can go and modify the code and make it column-wise, nobody stops you.
Nobody stops me. But I have the problem. Why they are following the pattern? The reason for the pattern.
I mean, this is strange. I mean, I see all that. Like, see, there is no. You can't feed a two-dimensional data to a fully connected network. Do you agree?
Yes.
Yeah.
But in the sense of quantization manner with respect to that axis of that y. So we split that image into row manner. That is, the row is equal to the height, right?
See, if I ask you if I ask you a counter question, now you did the convolution row wise, right? First,
Yes.
and then column wise. Why not do other way around? You get a different result.
Pardon me?
Do you get a different result when I convolve row wise first and then column
No,
wise,
still
or
I
column wise
didn't train. Still I didn't train anything.
Mhm.
But I'm using that some written codes I get from that MATLAB. I
Mhm.
trained that.
Mhm.
In the training, they are, most of the cases they are using vertical, and
Mhm.
then they transformed into horizontal. That 784, that is in that digit.
Mr. Loganathan, yeah.
Yes. Hello. Yes, sir. Hello. I'm not getting you, sir.
No, no, no. You took the row wise, right? You just take it column wise as well. My hunch is that like there won't be any change in the results of your fully connected network.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other quick questions?
Any questions?
Yeah,
Please.
Arunesh Tiwari. Yeah. Use the
Yeah.
chat box cells.
You
Yeah.
can go ahead. Yeah. Ask the question. Yeah, if you're unable to speak, you can also chat. Basically, you can post your question in the chat box.
Arunesh, are you there? Use the chat box cells. It would have been typed by this time.
I don't know if he's
Yeah,
able
if a
to.
question is not, I have one question, Professor Deepak.
Please, please. Yeah, please.
Yeah,
Dr. Rajesh.
we know normally using the conventional ANN, artificial neural network, and normalization, and we go into the classical way of using the G algorithm, genetic algorithm. So it seems in the convolution neural network CNN, so we are using the other platform. These hurdles were there, that is minimized, or still we can use go with G, and the normalization is required here.
But like any network, we do have to do the data normalization. So there are different types of data normalization. One I showed you was divided by the max, basically. Here, if I just showed you here, this is one sort of data normalization. Yeah, just take the data and divide it by the max value.
Oh, yeah. This is like a conventional classical way what we are using in ANN, similar way in the for the CNN
Correct,
also.
correct, correct. Exactly. Yeah.
But here, yeah, there is a no some issues like execution time and other, because no machine learning and CNN are used for normally GitHub and a large number of data set and databases. ANN, we are having few data sets. 100 or 1000 data sets of images are, particularly my area of EEG signal processing, EEG scissor prediction, several days, 2-3 days of records we are using. But if it is for a whole community of EEG scissor patients are there, in that case, if I use normalization and GA, can complexity and the time of processing, can it be affected, or it is the same like in ANN?
No, this is how we actually normalize. I mean, there are other normalization techniques as well, but generally, to begin with, we can go by this kind of normalization for the data.
Wow. What about the time consuming, time of processing is a
No, normalization doesn't have affect
no,
the.
no, no, use of GA for large data sets. which of the features we have to take, and we have to select the features. No, we are
Huh.
from 20 features. It is to be 12 optimal features are to be selected. In that case,
Yeah, see, coming to the features, there are two aspects to it. If we have less amount of data with us, too much less data, then it's good to use the handcrafted features from our signal processing techniques as a set of features. If we have large amount of data, then it makes sense for us to use the CNN layers to extract as the features. And there are other ways of deriving the features as well. There is something called as encoder decoder architecture, using which we can extract the bottleneck features as well. And once we extract these features, we have to normalize this data before we give it to the classification purpose. So again, normalization, one such normalization is the maximum divided by maximum value. So there are other types of normalizations as well. Yeah. Dr. Ravish?
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah. Convinced.
Okay.
Yeah, normalization
Yeah.
not taking much time, not a complexity,
It doesn't
but
take much
that's
time.
what
The whole time consuming
selection of features. Yeah, selection of
features.
features.
Yeah. Correct. So whole time consuming process is the training process here. When it starts to the network and then it iterates, right? That's where most of the time consuming happens. Yeah.
This looks a very silly question, but the thing is, well, was searching for the machine learning and CNN,
normalization
the ANN to that
critical
differences are there. Yeah, enormous amount of data to be processed. No, something will be come in mind about the processing time.
Correct. So people do go without normalization, they'll end up in trouble. Basically, we have to normalize the data. It's a important.
That's why, yeah, classical way. Yeah. For participant, any queries? You can take another one or two question. One question.
Yeah.
Yeah, if not, it is my immense pleasure to have today the speaker from the Pioneer Institution, IIIT, Dharwad, Karnataka, Indian Institute of Information and Technology, and where the Pioneer academic institutions are there. The recent technologies that has been taught and they were doing the R&D. So really to have the session on the CNN. So that is, it is connected as electrophysiology and neuroinstrumentation. Somehow processing and classification is required for that. We can connect. This is the application of to any of the field for the research interest. So the purpose is served, it seems, for the theme of thrust area of biomedical engineering and our area, neuroinstrumentation. We can use this purpose. And I thank very much for Dr. Deepak to be given a very nice, wonderful session today. I thank participant also for patience in hearing and very interactive session. I thank Professor Deepak.
Thank you, Dr. Ravish. Thanks for this opportunity. It was a long time we just met each other. This was an opportunity for me, and thanks to all the participants who patiently listened to this. I've given the mail ID in case they want to have some more questions. They can always mail me. That should be fine. So there's one question. Can you tell me the general steps we need to follow for the pattern recognition? Yeah, generally speaking, one is that like the pre-processing block is there. Post that pre-processing block, we do have feature extraction module, and post that feature extraction, we can have a classification algorithm. So that's the general way of connecting different modules. But now, since data is large, everything is all taken care by one single block that is called as deep learning module. So everything is all taken care by that. Okay, Dr. Ravish, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Have a good day. Yeah, for the participant, we'll once again now meet at 11:45. You can take a refreshment break now. Have your coffee and some other work, and you can rejoin for the second session.